Well, hello. We are going to go ahead and get started with our program tonight. SA Foxx has joined us on the live stream, and so we really want to respect her time. So, thank you. So, hello. Students, faculty, and guests, welcome to Vermont Law and Graduate School. Today's event, Career Challenges in the Law, a conversation with Cook County, Illinois State Attorney, Kimberly Foxx. My name is Robert Turner, Jr., and I am a Juris Doctor and Master's of Energy Regulation and Law student here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Phi Alpha Delta, in cooperation with the Black Student Association and the Student Bar Association, is bringing this particular presentation to you today. Before I go any further, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the presence of Vermont Law and Graduate School esteemed leadership. And President Smolla is also here with us today, and he will be speaking here momentarily. Today's event aim is to provide a unique perspective from a remarkable leader within the legal community, Cook County, Illinois State Attorney Kimberly Foxx. SA Foxx has a multifarious accomplishments, including becoming the first African-American woman to hold the title of State's Attorney for Cook County, Illinois, which encompasses the city of Chicago. By working proactively to make all neighborhoods safe and investing in policies to address the underlying causes of contact with the criminal justice system, SA Foxx's vision is to create the nation's most just, equitable, and transparent prosecutorial office. She is a graduate of Southern Illinois University, where she earned a BA in political science and a JD in the School of Law. SA Foxx was elected to the top prosecutor's position in 2016, and she is in her second term, which she actually won re-election in 2020. Thank you. Without going further into SA Foxx's story, I can tell you she is Chicago, and her story is inspiring. So as we look forward to hearing from her momentarily, President Smolla is going to have a few words. President Smolla.
Thank you. I have the pleasure, State's Attorney Foxx, of welcoming you on behalf of the Vermont Law and Graduate School. I'm pretty new to Vermont. I just moved here in July, and I'm the new president here. When I was interviewing, the folks asked me, well, are you sure you could live in a place as cold as Vermont? And I said, no problem, I grew up in Chicago. So I grew up in Chicago. My dad was an air traffic controller, and I, after law school, was admitted to the Illinois bar in 1979. And I remember as if it were yesterday, terrified as I walked into the Daily Plaza the very first time to argue a case in the Circuit Court of Cook County. And then not long after that, was shaking in my boots, because I had to have boots. There was snow on the ground, arguing in front of Judge Prentice Marshall in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. It's a wonderful personal pleasure to welcome a fellow Chicago lawyer. I'm still admitted in Illinois. I still argue cases in the state and federal courts there from time to time. By coincidence, State's Attorney Foxx, my daughter, one of our kids, is in Chicago today. She's a young law student at American University, but she works during the day for Feeding America. And she's in the big city. All of my kids have been forced as a matter of religion to be Chicago sports fans. She's in the city today because Feeding America is welcoming to its board the first Native American to ever be on its board. More importantly, I have admired your time as the state's attorney in Cook County from afar. You are truly one of the national leaders on the issues of justice reform, which takes a lot of courage and integrity. You are the head of the second largest prosecutor's office in the United States, but as a fellow Chicagoan, we don't really like to be called the second city so much, and we know that we're the most important. And for someone as impactful and as influential as you on the national scene, to be leading in all of the various arenas that comprise the agenda of justice reform is enormously important. It's something very important to the identity of this school and very important to our country and very important to me as an Illinois lawyer. So it's a delight to welcome you here. I hope you get to come in person someday to Vermont, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, Vermont Law School, for having me. I wish very much that I could be there in person because I have never been to Vermont. But for friends of mine who have gone there, they love it. And as you indicated, we are not in any way intimidated by the cold at all. And so it is my sincere hope that I make it to Vermont into the law school in person before my tenure is over. And you all are incredibly fortunate in Vermont to have incredible leadership in prosecutorial reform in Sarah George, who is the prosecuting attorney out of Chittenden, I hope I'm saying it right, County, who also was recently reelected on a platform of reform. And Sarah is someone I admire truly and deeply. And so it is an honor to be visiting her, her home state for today's remarks. I hope you don't mind because in as much as it is cold in Chicago in the winter, I am warm right now. So I'm gonna take off my jacket so we can have an intimate conversation about the challenges and doing. I heard somebody say, whoop, that's okay. Cool, thank you. Because I think this conversation requires us to get comfortable talking about the uncomfortable. As President Smolla indicated, you know, I am Chicago through and through. And to be from Chicago is to have a tremendous amount of pride in our city, our resiliency, the fact that this is a city that literally burned to ashes after the Great Chicago Fire and built itself back up. And while we don't like being called the second city, we know we are second to none, but it is our resilience, it is our tenacity, it is our fight that has allowed for us to sit where we sit. But the reality is that in the midst of all of that, we also have a legacy in our criminal legal system here that is one that has been filled with challenge. A criminal legal system that has had a history, particularly in its prosecutor's office, of abuse. Many of you may have heard and seen movies or the stories of the assassination of Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton, back in the late 60s, was a young, energetic, innovative, thoughtful, revolutionary leader of the Black Panther Party of Illinois. And in December of 1969, the then Cook County State's Attorney signed off on a warrant that allowed for Chicago police to go into Fred Hampton's home where he was assassinated as he slept. That was by the direction of the person who formerly held this seat. Many of you may have heard the stories of the 1960s where we held the Democratic National Convention, and we're vying for that once again, where there was so much police brutality and atrocities that there were 6 or 7 activists who went on trial for their efforts to bring about racial equity and freedom, who were brutally beaten by Chicago police. And it took much effort to try to hold people accountable for the brutality that was inflicted upon them. And instead, they found themselves on trial. You may have heard the stories of John Burge, who was a notorious Chicago police commander, who in the 80s and early 90s inflicted torture on Black men on the city's South Side in order to get them to confess to crimes that they didn't commit. His crimes were so infamous that Illinois abolished the death penalty in the early aughts because there were so many people who were on death row for crimes they didn't commit at the hands of John Burge. We have Chicago the unfortunate reputation of being called the false confession capital of the United States. That's our legal system. Then the city. If you know anything about me, is this part of the story that I tell you where I grew up in this city? And again, when we talk about resilience and strength, I am what we would call in Chicago a project chick. I grew up in public housing, one of the most notorious public housing complexes in the country, Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green has got infamy for those who have been around a long time, from the 1970 sitcom show Good Times to those who may have seen the recent movie Candyman and its reboot just 2 years ago that talked about the horrors and atrocities that was allowed to fester in Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green was a failed experiment in what one would dub affordable housing, but it laid bare the systemic racism that flows through many of our systems that lead to conditions that cause violence in our communities. It was a housing project that was built in towers, and so we're talking about concentrated poverty stacked literally on top of one another, segregated in a city. It was less than a mile for some of the most affluent neighborhoods in the country, and yet sat alone. Concentrated poverty, schools that were underfunded, an economy that was largely driven by narcotic sales, unemployment rates that outpaced sometimes by twice as much as the rest of the city, and a neighborhood that was besieged by violence. And the reputation that Cabrini had for violence was national. And I mention that because I grew up there. I was born there, born and raised there, born to a teenage mother who was 18 when she had me, 17 when she had my brother, who dropped out of high school after she gave birth to me. And we lived in the projects. My father moved off to go to college. And so I was raised by a single teenage mother with the help of my grandmother who lived in the same building. And I had aunts who lived in the same community. But I had what and you study this in the work in law school around criminology, the risk factors that we see for people who end up in our criminal justice system. I was born in concentrated poverty. I came from a single parent household. I was, and I talk openly about having been a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and trauma. I also witnessed trauma on a daily basis in that I had friends who I would jump rope with who had been shot. I had family members who had been shot. And also tragically, I had family members who pulled triggers. And so these conditions, these factors, these adverse childhood experiences, ACEs that we talk about, or I had them all. I had them all. And so it would be no surprise that you would see someone like me end up in the criminal justice system, just not as the top prosecutor. And that's what I want to talk about. Because there is this notion, and when people get very excited when I tell them my story about how I grew up, where I grew up, and what I do, they are fascinated. How did you do it? How did you make it? How did you make it out of those conditions to not only be a lawyer, but to be the state's attorney at the second largest prosecutor's office in the country? How did you do it? And I have to remind people that by merely asking that question, you recognize that it is premised on the supposition that someone like me is supposed to fail. It's premised on the supposition if I am remarkable to you, it is because we already know that people who live in the conditions like the conditions that I grew up in are supposed to fail. And we recognize that those same people with those same conditions are far more likely not to be lawyers in our criminal justice system, but in fact defendants or victims. And if we accept the supposition, right, that those factors, those conditions under which I lived, my lived experience, cause many people like me to end up in our criminal justice system, then it challenges our notions about violence, about crime. And it makes us have to reckon with systemic issues around economics, education, mental health, poverty, and violence. That it is not enough to simply say that certain people commit violent acts by the very nature of who they are, because we know it's simply to not be true. Now, President Smolla, talks about having been from Chicago, and so he knows personally that this city, one of the greatest cities in the world, is also one of the most segregated cities in the world. And that neighborhood that I grew up in, Cabrini Green, this neighborhood that sat less than a mile from some of the most affluent neighborhoods in the country, no longer exists. When I grew up there, like I said, it was a community in and of itself, where jobs and opportunity were rare. Today, when those projects were torn down back in 2012, what then replaced it was a neighborhood that had multiple grocery stores. Now, when I grew up there, we had one, and it wasn't really a grocery store. This is a neighborhood that now has some of the most expensive homes in the city of Chicago. It's a neighborhood now that has some of the lowest incidents of violence in all of Cook County. The same plots of land as the one that I grew up in, where we had the most violence in the city, is now one of the safest. It is a neighborhood that today has an iFly. And I don't know if you all have iFlies out in Vermont, but iFly is an indoor skydiving place where people who don't want to take the actual risk of jumping out of airplanes go into an indoor place, into a wind tunnel, and they fly in a wind tunnel. Now, I will acknowledge that I'm a bit skeptical of these places because I've actually jumped out of an airplane. And so I like to brag on that. But secondarily, what kind of neighborhood has enough resources that you can have grocery stores and a place that you could pretend to jump out of airplanes? And when when Cabrini went down and then the neighborhood was destroyed and gentrified, very gentrified, the people who lived in those communities were then flung far and wide across our county into other neighborhoods that were lacking the same resources that were lacking when I grew up. And those neighborhoods saw an increase in crime. It is not because people who live in the projects are particularly violent. It is because we know that healthy, thriving neighborhoods have less crime. Neighborhoods where you can go pick up a piece of fruit to make or to give your child a snack, to be able to buy fresh produce, to live healthily, where people can work and provide for their families, where their needs, whether physical or mental or psychological, are met, are less likely to engage in criminal activity, where you are thriving and not simply trying to survive. And so where we now see higher incidents of violence, violence that is readily talked about on national news, which I will say is, and not just because I love this place and because I work here, is overblown, because we do have a serious violence issue in our communities. But the Chicago as a whipping boy is a national conversation for violence is not well earned. But what has happened is that those people who live in neighborhoods that have continually been deprived of resources, that don't have access to an iFly or a grocery store, who are still reeling from the economic deprivations of the 60s, have high incidence of violence. That's just the truth. And so why do I start there? I start there because when we talk about challenges with the law, challenges with the profession, we as lawyers tend to do the thing we always do. What does the statute say? What does the book tell us? Do we have a crime or not? Can we prove our elements or not? Can we persuade people of our position or not? And particularly in the realm of criminal justice, we have, as lawyers, distilled all of that information that I gave you down to black or white, to right or wrong. And in doing that, we have utilized a system that is overly punitive, that is disregarding of the circumstances that I just described to you, and that, I will be quite honest, is rooted in an acceptance of systemic racism. It's rooted in that. Because all of those institutions that I talked about earlier, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's economics, those things have been embedded in those systems that have allowed for communities to suffer. And then when they engage in behaviors that is not to be unexpected, again, that's the supposition I talked about, that we know that those conditions lead to certain types of behavior, we pretend like none of those things matter. We focus our attention on the final act. And it is why we have a system that is failing communities like the one I grew up in. It is why we have a system that, if we were in fact doing it right, if we were engaging in the practice that was making us safer, we would have been safe a long time ago. If putting everybody in jail, if being as punitive as we could worked, Chicago would be one of the safest cities in the world. America would be the safest nation in the world if locking everyone up and having an incarceration-focused system worked. When I was in high school, and we going back a minute, I had a friend who was murdered back in 1989. And in 1989, that friend was one of almost 950 people who were murdered in the city of Chicago that year. In 1990, there were 990 people murdered in the city of Chicago. 990. Back in 2021, we had 800 people who were murdered in the city of Chicago. How is it? How is it that when I was 17 years old, we had 900 plus murders in the city of Chicago, and now I turned 50 this year, we had almost the same amount? How do we justify that the system that we have right now is working? How? How do we justify that? I want to back up for a second before we talk about the other challenges. The main challenge being we have to question how we define safety and how we define our responses and our over-reliance on systems that are embedded with racism. So to end, I went to a school in one of those affluent neighborhoods, a magnet school, LaSalle Language Academy. And I was able to get there because my mother, recognizing that our opportunities in Cabrini were very limited because no one made it out of Cabrini that she saw. And I should be clear, I've met some remarkable people who've had remarkable lives and careers who came from Cabrini. The first Black male or Black CEO of McDonald's, Don Thompson, was a Cabrini Green native. Jesse White, who is our Secretary of State, longest serving Secretary of State, comes from Cabrini. We got strong stuff out of Cabrini. But my mother recognized that those seemed like few and far between. So she moved us to a neighborhood called Lincoln Park, one of the more affluent neighborhoods that was just a bit away, so that I could go to LaSalle Language Academy. And I went to LaSalle Language Academy starting in 3rd grade, where I was labeled as gifted. Now here's the thing. I'm gifted. I'll own that. But I wasn't the most gifted person in my building. Probably not even the most gifted person in my family. But I was married to an institution that recognized my gift. An institution that wasn't struggling to figure out if we had enough books. They taught Spanish, French, German, and Italian starting in kindergarten. And the fact that I got there in 3rd grade, they didn't care. I needed to know as much Spanish as every other 3rd grader who had been taking Spanish in kindergarten. I had to learn about classical music, and I got to go to some of our most cherished institutions starting in 3rd grade. I was encouraged to write. I was encouraged to join the debate team. I won our extemporaneous speech contest back in the 7th grade. I got the kind of education that every child deserves And I would have to go back to my family in Cabrini when I would visit my grandmother and my cousins and watch them scramble to get a book. When I say it's systemic, it's not like because I heard, so I saw it. I saw the kind of education that I had versus the same people with the same DNA, with the same experiences I get deprived of that. That fundamentally changed my outcomes as a third grader. My brother, who was 11 months older than me, was able to be introduced to the theater and to the arts at LaSalle. My brother eventually went on to go to Juilliard to study acting. Now that sounds remarkable. First Black woman prosecutor, brother, a Juilliard actor, has been on television and in movies, and people would think, oh my gosh, their mother must be incredible. She was a high school dropout. A high school dropout who suffered from bipolar disorder, who smoked marijuana almost every day since I was a child. Because her bipolar disorder wasn't diagnosed to many years later when she had a good city job that allowed for her to have good insurance, that then allowed for her to go and get assessed and diagnosed and treated, and then realized that she wasn't new to bipolar at 40. She was undiagnosed at 17 and was self-medicating with marijuana, a drug that under the laws that existed at the time that she was coming up and I was coming up as her child could land her in jail. A diagnosis that one day when she snapped off at work on a coworker because she was in the midst of an episode that hadn't been diagnosed caused her to be suspended for 29 days. And when you are suspended from work for 29 days and you're living check to check, guess what happens? We lost our housing. We lost our housing. I was homeless for 6 months during my junior year of high school. I went to school by day and went from shelter to shelter to shelter at night. And what I can also tell you, that there were some incredibly brilliant children, mothers, and not fathers, because many of these shelters wouldn't allow men into the shelter. In fact, my brother and I had to be separated because most of the shelters within the city of Chicago would not allow for boys of a certain age to be in the shelters with women. Brilliance, brilliance. Many of those people who were in those shelters wound up in our criminal justice system. See, I'm a navigator, right? All of these landmines, a mother with mental health issues and substance use issues and undiagnosed and untreated mental health and trauma end up in our systems. I had the benefit of those systems when they periodically worked and gave me the same opportunities that others who did not have to navigate. I had to take the same SAT as a non-unhoused person. When we talk about equity, I had to take the same AP exams as people who had food in their stomachs. When we talk about privilege, and people say there's no such thing as privilege, there are people right now having to take the same tests and do the same activities as those of you who are fortunate enough to never have to know the realities of what it means to be unhoused and hungry. And so I'm a hustler. That's just who I am. I was raised by a hustler. I was raised by a community of folks who learned how to survive. And I had the benefit of like unlocking the codes and was able to go to college and law school and become a lawyer. And it is because of those experiences and because I worked in this, I saw a system that chewed people like me up and spit me out that I wanted to be the top prosecutor. I wanted to be the state's attorney because I heard so many people talk about victims and I recognized that they weren't talking about me. I recognized so many people talk about, we want to advocate on behalf of communities, except they weren't talking about the communities like the one that I grew up in. I heard so many people talk about the institutions in our criminal justice system as though they could do no harm while ignoring that the chief prosecutor called for the assassination of the leader of the Black Panther Party. And I knew that by being in this role and the tremendous power that we wield as prosecutors, that I would be able to give visibility and space and set the table for those communities who are most impacted by our justice system. Most impacted. To be able to bring their voices to bear, to have someone with the lived experience, not just be welcomed into the room, not just to set a chair for me at the table. I'm going to set the agenda. That's been my goal. And so that has driven the policy decisions that I have made in this office. It has driven how I have approached this work. And it has made me, quite honestly, unapologetic despite the pushback that I get for the work that I do, because I'm doing it in Chicago, and there is nobody more Chicago than me, period. And so that has meant for me the thing where we said we gonna do what we said we're gonna do, like not prosecute people for smoking marijuana. That was personal to me. My mother was a good mother. My mother, who people are like, wow, she must have been great to put you in the position to be where you are, by the eyes of the law was a criminal. My mother could have been separated from us had someone discovered that she had a dime bag in her purse. And the reality is we do that, we were doing that every single day, taking mothers from their children, taking fathers from their children, taking people from their community for marijuana, for marijuana. So I worked with our state legislature to legalize marijuana, and marijuana became legal in 2020. And I pushed for the first of its kind legislation where we said we were now vacating automatically, without anyone having to petition for it or pay for it, anyone who was previously convicted for marijuana possession for amounts that are now legal. And just this past year, we vacated our 15,000 conviction here in Cook County. That was for my mom. We also stopped prosecuting people for driving on suspended licenses. These are poverty issues. Because if you're driving on a suspended license and your license was suspended because you couldn't afford to pay your ticket, what makes anybody with logical sense think that by now jailing you, assigning you a bail that you now have to pay when you're not at work because you are in jail? So now you have to pay a bail, and that money that you could have used to pay the tickets went to the bail, and you've lost your job because you were in jail. It's a cycle. It's ridiculous. And when you looked in our traffic court and saw who was being prosecuted for driving on suspended licenses for failure to pay tickets, 94% of them were people of color. So we said we weren't going to do that. We stopped doing that. And I tell you that we had, when I came into office in 2016, in 2016, it was the bloodiest year that we had seen in the city of Chicago since 99. We had 763 murders just in the city of Chicago alone. And you should know the city of Chicago is just half of my jurisdiction. We have 5.4 million people that I serve. City of Chicago has 2.7 of those people, 2.7 million of those people. But in 2016, the number one referred case for prosecution in our office, second largest prosecutor's office in the country, dealing with the issues of gun violence. The number one referred prosecution in our office was drugs, not big cartels, people who had usable amounts on them, who were suffering from substance use disorder, who had no treatment. That's who we were prosecuting. Number two, retail theft, shopping. We were masterful to the tune of almost 20,000 people a year of prosecuting for low-level shoplifting. Here's what you should know. In Illinois, the felony threshold for shoplifting is $300 today. It's $300. And it's amazing to me because I hear all these conversations about inflation, and inflation is real. Man, I went to the grocery store the other day. I had like half a cart and like my whole wallet was gone. Inflation is real. So imagine a $300 threshold for a felony that was established some 20 some years ago that didn't account for inflation. And what we were ended up seeing was that we were sending people to jail, to prison, for stealing a pair of shoes. And so I said, what are other jurisdictions doing? Indiana, which is our neighbor, which, you know, at the time had like Mike Pence had just gone to the White House. So a fairly conservative place. Their threshold was $750. To the north, Wisconsin, their threshold was $2,000. Iowa was $750. Missouri, when I looked around, everywhere around us had a threshold at least twice as high as Cook, as Illinois. We were 47 or 46 other states had a higher threshold than Illinois. We're known for our violence. We're known for having these issues around crime, violent crime. And we were spending the majority of our resources going after nonviolent offenses. And so I used my prosecutorial discretion and raised the threshold, having done the research with Pew, having done the research and looking across the country and seeing what thresholds were and seeing that there was no rise in crime rates, and said that we were going to make it $1,000, and we did. And in 2016, where drugs and retail theft were the #1 and 2 most prosecuted cases in our office, in 2017, it became guns. In 2018, it was guns. In 2019, guns. 2020, 2021, guns. Because that is the most pressing issue for our office today. Not chasing people who are poor and easy to catch because of substance use disorder or poverty. And these are things that we were good at, that we could tout our crime numbers. We could look at our jail, a jail, by the way, which is the largest single site jail in the country when I took over, that on any given day back in 2012, had 11,000 people in it, a jail that had been under a federal consent decree since I was a high school student, many, many moons ago. A jail that when I was a junior in high school, they did one of those scared straight trips. And I went to Cook County Jail as a junior, and it scared me so straight, I am a prosecutor. That's how bad that jail was. Filled with people who were there for nonviolent offenses. 70% of the people who were in our jail, 70% of the people who were in our jail in 2012 were there for nonviolent offenses. I know this because prior to taking this role, I was a line assistant in this office for many years. I left to become the chief of staff for the president of our county board, and I was tasked with managing the cost at our jail. And what we realized is that we had more people in that jail for nonviolent offenses who were too poor to pay their way out versus that they were a threat to the public. We had people charged with murder who would get a $100,000 bond and post their bond and walk out the door. And we had people charged with stealing food who had a $100 bond who couldn't get out. And so what did we do? We said that when I came in the office, I could not stand for that. I knew the numbers, I knew the data, and I knew it wasn't making us safer to operate under this way. And so we changed how we ask for cash bail. And what I'm extraordinarily proud of, and despite you talk about pushbacks and challenges, and I want to get to your questions, one of the biggest pushbacks we're in right now is that Illinois in 2021 passed a law that made us the first state by legislation to abolish cash bail in the state of Illinois. Done. Starting January 1st, 2023, Illinois will have abolished cash bail. And it is not without pushback, challenges in the law. And so I'll wrap with that. Those are some of our big accomplishments. The legalization of marijuana, the vacating of conviction related to marijuana. Oh, I should also say, I started with the troubled legal system that we have around police brutality and a lack of accountability. Just last week, I charged 2 police officers for an on-duty shooting in which they shot an unarmed man and then filled out police reports and tried to charge someone else for a crime. And it turned out that they were not being honest, and we charged them. These were the 10th and 11th police officers that I've charged for on-duty violence that they've inflicted during my tenure. I also have vacated the convictions of well over 200 men and women who were wrongfully convicted by a corrupt Chicago police officer who preyed on another public housing project and planted guns and drugs on the residents there as part of shakedowns. 225 cases have been vacated. And then just this summer, we vacated in the first of its kind in the nation, almost a dozen convictions tied to another corrupt police detective, this time involving cases of homicide. And the horror of that is not only the people who were wrongfully convicted, but also the families of those victims who believed that justice had been served so many years ago in the deaths of their loved ones, only to have that corrupted. And so to date, this office has vacated over, separate and apart from the thousands of marijuana cases, over 250 wrongful convictions just in the last 6 years. And I did all of those things driven by an agenda, right? There's this whole notion of the progressive prosecutor movement, and it like makes my skin itch sometimes because there was no movement in 2016. The movement for me, in terms of the policy agendas, the things that I wanted to do, started in apartment 806 at 624 West Division, with the recognition that the family that raised me, who were brilliant and bright and beautiful, did not have the same access to opportunities as people who lived just a few miles away. And that we had systems in place to ensure that the people who lived in neighborhoods like mine could not reach their highest potential. And one of the ways that we ensured that was to have a criminal legal system that did everything that it could to put people in a caste system and not see the full potential that they have to offer. And so my agenda wasn't driven by anything other than my mother could have went to prison for having bipolar and self-medicating, and I wouldn't be here today. It is driven by those kids that I saw in that homeless shelter who I know that their adverse childhood experiences gave them a greater likelihood of ending up in the criminal legal system and not being a lawyer in it. I am driven by a sense of survivor's remorse and a sense of eternal optimism that a kid like me from the projects of Chicago could go on and lead an office like this. And I want to make sure that every kid in every neighborhood has that exact same chance. And so this policy agenda is for them. So I talked more than I said I would. So I'll certainly take questions a bit longer. I got to run, but I talked way longer than I should have. And I certainly want to get to your questions. So I turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, S.A. Foxx. We really appreciate your time and your comments. We do have a few questions, and actually, we're going to take one from Elsa.
Yes. Hi, S.A. Foxx. My name is Elsa Yosef. I'm Vice Justice of Phi Alpha Delta here at Vermont Law and Graduate School, also doing my master's at Bard College. So I have some of the advanced questions that we've collected for this event. And for those in the audience, we do have the microphone here. So if you have any live questions, feel free to stand here. But first and foremost, continuing on with your story, the question we got in advance from one of our students is, as a progressive for change, how do you manage the traditional parts of your job, especially the day-to-day tasks like prosecuting people?
Listen, that is the job, right? And so even though I have an agenda that is different than those who've had it, I also have a mandate around public safety. And so it is, the way that I approach it is I have limited resources, and so I have to prioritize. My number one priority is addressing violent crime. It has to be. Like I said, even though I believe that the narrative around Chicago violence is wildly overblown, we have far too much gun violence in our city. We're losing far too many of our children, of our elders. They're people who should not have to fear for their safety to go buy a gallon of milk. And so there are things that I have to do, right? And I recognize the systemic issues that lead for people to engage in criminal behavior. And I think we need to address that. And I work with our partners to do that. And at the same time, we need to hold people accountable. And what accountability looks like and how we measure accountability is something that we take into account. How much is too much? What is the dosage that needs to happen? How do we incorporate restorative justice? How do we make sure, that we are not doing something just for the sake of doing it because we've always done it that way? How do we incorporate the voices of impacted citizens who've been formerly incarcerated to the table to see if what we're doing is right? But at the forefront of what I do is about public safety. And the reality is that these items that I'm talking about are in furtherance of that. People who don't have criminal convictions because of low-level drug offenses or for retail theft are more likely to get a job. People who have jobs are less likely to engage in criminal behavior. And so there's no separation between public safety and reform. In fact, you cannot have public safety without meaningful criminal justice reform. But we also have to do our jobs and hold people accountable when they cause harm to our community. But we have to be thoughtful in our response to that because we need those people, because it is rare for people to go to jail forever. There's a small subset of folks who will be locked up forever. So we have to be thoughtful about people who go into our system and how they come out and how we ensure that they don't commit the same acts again, because it is in the interest of public safety to do so. But my job is to hold people accountable.
Okay, not seeing any questions from the audience just yet. One other question going back to your career and the years leading up to becoming an attorney. Who have been some of your biggest influences and mentors throughout developing your career, and what is some of the best advice they have given you?
I'm going to say my mom, who passed away in 2012, and my grandmother. We have a common story of people who left the South of my family and part of the Great Migration in the 20s and 30s, who left Arkansas on my mother's side, Mississippi on my father's side, to make a better life and fleeing from racialized violence of the South. And their absolute tenacity. My grandmother sold Avon, she cleaned houses, she drove people to church. Like before there was an actual gig economy, like my grandmother was like the queen of gigs. And my mother, who, like I said, had 2 children by the time that she was 18, who was able to provide and have the understanding enough to recognize the barriers that were put on us to break through and find a way, even though she couldn't afford the way, to provide me with an education to get me here. In my career, there's a woman named Kathy Bankhead, who was a supervisor when I was a young assistant in our child abuse and neglect division here in the office, who was a mentor to me and who, to this day, when I see her, I credit her with showing up in my full self to do this work. I'll say this: when you are a Black face in a space that does not look like yours, people tend to have the tendency to want to not to fit in, especially in this work, right? Especially in this work, right? Because most of your defendants are Black. Most of your victims are Black. Most of them come from neighborhoods that my colleagues have never had to go to. And so you will hear them say things and then go, but not you, Kim. And it's like, no, that's absolutely me, right? And in your early parts of your career, you don't want to be the angry Black woman. You don't want to be the representative for the entire Black race. You don't want to be the educator. You don't want to be, Kim, let me ask you, what is it that Black people, I'm just Kim, right? And y'all are laughing. I'll say it for you. Colleagues that are doing this to your colleagues in the room, stop it. There's a mutual work that has to come with this. And so there's a tendency to shrink, to I don't want to say blend to diminish yourself, but there's a shrinkage that happens, particularly when you are one of but a few. And Kathy Bankhead was a supervisor in our office who I met. I had just come down from maternity leave after my first child. I'd never seen her before. And she had her hair in this glorious afro. And she was talking about a group home that had been under investigation. And she had gone to visit the group home and she came back and she was in tears. One thing that you don't see, prosecutors don't cry. And this woman was crying because she talked about seeing all of these Black boys at this group home, and she was the mother of a 14-year-old son. And her 14-year-old son would drive her absolutely crazy, but every day before he walked out the door, even in his craziest of moments, she would say, "Nicholas, I love you." And he would say, "I love you back," and they would embrace. And she said when she went to that group home, this group home that had all these stories of violence that was happening in there, she said, "I realized that we were housing children, not raising them, that they didn't have someone who every morning, even in their worst of their mistakes, who were telling them that they loved him. And how can we be okay with the system that is so devoid of the most basic things that a child needs, which is affirmation and love?" And she is bawling. And I felt that. And I heard some of my colleagues, "What's wrong with her? Oh my God, she's soft, blah, blah, blah." And it was in that moment, in that speech, in that thing that was like level setting about, I'm not just about law books. I'm not just, can I prove that this child was abused or neglected? What does this child need? And how do we as system holders be vulnerable enough to say that this, what we're doing, isn't cutting it? She changed how I showed up at work. She changed how I showed up in my space. She changed how I used my voice, even when I thought nobody cared. And then you just could not stop me from talking. And I would say to people, and I say this now, I encourage people to show up in their whole fullness. You got to. You don't have to be someone's interpreter. You don't have to be like the whisperer. You just got to be you. Because there are people who are counting on you to see them. They're counting on you to see them. And if you are so concerned about the people over here who already have the access in the space that you are ignoring the people who are counting on you to see them, you are not doing the service that you think you are. And so she is literally, every time I see her, I get emotional, because the way that I lead now, these personal stories that you hear about, that I've just shared with you, that I share with everyone, the reason I am so able to bear that is because I recognize that solid leadership requires a level of vulnerability that makes you uncomfortable, so that the person who is never seen has their moment to be seen.
That was a really powerful story. Thank you for that. You kind of answered it a little bit, but if you want to expound, the next question I was going to ask you is, why does diversity matter in the legal profession?
I think we all know, and in these conversations that we've had in the last several years in the post George Floyd era, have been incredibly frustrating to me, because the reality is we already know. We already know, right? The lived experiences of folks, and folks aren't a monolith, right? It's the reason that I start with, like, I am a project chick. And people get like, "Oh my God," because it's true. I was raised in the projects. I have a 20-year-old, an 18 or a 19-year-old, an 18-year-old, and two 16-year-old daughters. I have 4 daughters. They're not project chicks. They live in the burg. If I drop them off in a certain neighborhood, God help us all, right? They live a very different life, right? They are Black children with Black mom, but they have a life of affluence that is very different than the one that I had. So we are not a monolith. We are not a monolith. So I want to be clear about that. However, there is an experience that is brought when there is a connection that you can have with your defendant, with your victim, with your witness, the language one of the things that is just so funny to me, just from a pure linguistic standpoint, I remember somebody was reading a transcript from a trial, and I forget what the phrase was, but it was something that they were interpreting as something else, right? And I was like, that's not what it means. That's not what it means. You know, because I have so many young people in my house, they use the phrase merch. I don't know if they use this in Vermont. Do y'all use the phrase merch?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, merch can mean anything, right? For me, merch is short for merchandise. I would like to buy that merch from this concert. That's not what it means to my kids. You'll say one kid will say, did you see that so-and-so had, lunch with so-and-so? Merch? And then you're like, what does that mean? Word? Like it meant for us? Did it mean like it? And then merch meant something else for something else. Merch. That one word in its many definitions requires that you have someone who knows what merch could mean 5 different things. Those types of experiences that come just from a pure linguistic standpoint matters. How people greet each other. What's up can take on 5 different meanings. What's up? What's up? What's up? 5 different meanings. If you're reading a script and you have taken an interpretation based off of your limited experience, you're not going to get there. We had, when I first came here, someone who was reading a transcript to a jury that involved the N-word. And he said the words. This was a white man, said the word. I almost fell off the bench. I also saw one of our jurors recoil. I called the gentleman into the office and I said, why did you do that? And he said, this is how we were trained, to use the words to use. And I said, who trained you? Who told you that was okay? And he told me the supervisors who told him it was okay. Guess what? The resonance of that word didn't hit them the same as it hit that juror, as it hit me. And he had no connection to it and thought he was doing the right thing because he was trained as such. He wasn't out there trying to offend. He thought he was being a good lawyer. And we could have lost that case. Hell, he could have lost his job if we hadn't had that conversation and understand why he did that. So diversity matters because the lived experiences of others make us better as a profession. It just does. The reason we have found ourselves in this mess with our criminal legal system now is because we have had far too many people with the exact same experiences, not welcoming in others and not appreciating the impact that those decisions have. When I came into office in 2016, 79% of elected prosecutors were white men, 79% in 2016. 16% were white women. That gets us to 95%. 4% were men of color. Less than 1% were women of color. Less than 1% were women of color. In Cook County Jail today, 74% of the detainees at Cook County Jail are Black. Another 15% are Latino. And we have people making decisions don't look like the folks that we serve. And it doesn't mean that you can't do this work if you don't come from that community, if you're not Black. It doesn't mean that at all. But something is fundamentally wrong when the people that you serve and their experiences and the things that they bring in totality is foreign to the people who are serving. You need diversity in order for us to have the best outcomes, whether you are in the criminal legal system or working in corporate America or nonprofit. It is across the board. We are all better served when we have diversity at the table.
So speaking of those with authority to make decisions and the seemingly recognized importance of diversity, why are there so few people of color in minority or leadership positions, and what needs to change to increase representation at that executive or leadership level?
So one thing I'm really proud of, and I have my director of legal hiring on here because I thought we were gonna have like a bunch of legal hiring questions, Sean Edding Levesque on here. We in this office, we are pretty well represented in our executive leadership by people of color. We have an overrepresentation, I will be honest, of Black women in these roles. And I listen, and I'm a shrug too, right? And someone said to me, and I don't say that with like a disdain or like, when an office head of this size, when we are fully staffed, we should have 800 plus lawyers who work for us. Our office, when we are fully staffed, should have about 1,300 people. We are one of the largest law firms in the country. We are the largest law firm in the state of Illinois. And when I was coming up in this office, it was largely led by white men. So even when I tell you the 79% of elected prosecutors were white men, there's a pipeline for them. There is a pipeline for them. And how people get promoted is like, what assignment did you have? How many juries have you done? And a lot of that was driven by who you knew. And so what you would see is the opportunities were being given to folks from that familiar category. And talent is ubiquitous. And so I know for me, again, don't forget I'm gifted, right? I was gifted when I came to this office. I knew I was a talent, but I knew I wasn't going to get the same opportunities as others were if I wasn't part of the Old Boys Network. And so one of the things that we did when I came was like, we're not doing that network anymore. Where's the talent? Where are the talented people of color? And I did that without apology. And people were like, oh, you're going to look like reverse racism. It wasn't about reverse racism. The systemic racism that was embedded into this office that disallowed for people of color to get the same opportunities as everyone else needed to be reversed. And there's a fear of being radical in how we reverse that, right? There's a fear of like, well, we don't want to look like we're doing some type of affirmative action. I don't care what you call it. I need a pipeline of talent, of people of color to be able to be in these positions. So when I am not here, the diversity at the tops and throughout this office is reflective of the communities we serve. And we will not do that by being incremental or tepid or sheepish or scared to look like we're doing the thing that people had done to us throughout the entirety of this profession. So we just did it. That's how we did it. And don't get me wrong, people sue and people complain. But what I know, so we did that, and then we put systems in place. You have to, you apply for roles. We interview people for roles. And what we found amazingly, when you give people an opportunity to show who they are and what they can do, that talent rises to the top. So it wasn't even just that we were putting unqualified people in positions, they were showing up and showing out with these systems in place. And so that's how we could, you can't replace one system of like proximity with another. You cannot do that. You can't. I think you need to do radical shifts and then build systems that try to equalize what you are doing. So we did a radical shift. We actively sought out talent and put people in positions. And then we developed a hiring scheme. We changed our hiring practices. We saw that we were excluding a number of people from coming into our office historically by asking, if you'd ever clerked at a public defender's office, people were getting washed out. If you didn't clerk at our office, right, it was one of the big things that we saw. If you didn't clerk in our office, because we're one of the premier clerking places, then you must not want to work here. If you grew up like me, unpaid clerkships ain't the business. I need to pay my bills. I want to work there, but I also am a struggling student. And so what we're seeing is that particularly students of color who could not afford unpaid internships were not being offered positions. And that wasn't because they weren't worthy or couldn't do it. Again, systemic issues related to economics were precluding them from doing that. And then we weren't bringing them into the office. So again, addressing those types of things. We weren't recruiting historically before this office came in, or this administration came in, from historically Black colleges. We weren't going to HBCUs and saying, hey, come be a prosecutor. We ceded that space to public defender's offices. And people, I remember, like people who were doing this work, I was like, what was the HBCU outreach? And someone was like, HBCU. Trying to figure out what the letters meant. And I know y'all in Vermont, so, you know, please apply as well. Please apply as well. I went to a PWI as well. Please apply. But we needed to be aggressive in addressing the things that we knew were barriers to lawyers of color coming in the door. And, you know, it's not just about recruitment, it's about retention. Then we have to see, hey, what is the culture here? Why do we lose so many Black men? We found, you know, that there were cultural things that were being said. We had a wall, for example, in our gangs unit that had pictures of people who had been previously convicted. Again, they're mostly Black and brown men. If you are a Black or brown person working in this office, walking by a wall of fame that looks like someone that could be related to you is discomforting. And so we had to take it down, take that down. And for the people who worked here who were like, that's not racist, it's not, you had to be able to absorb your discomfort of your traditions falling is worth having more people be included in this culture. And you just have to do that to retain them. And then you have to have mechanisms for promotion. So we have a strategy that is very aggressive around recruitment, retention, and promotion that is unapologetic about an agenda that promotes diversity and equity. The other thing I'll say before you ask your question, we also created first of its kind employee resource groups where we had, you know, specific communities that could come together, that could push the administration. And we had, you know, an African-American one, Latino, Asian, LGBTQ, women. We now have Middle Eastern. We now have a group dealing with people living with disabilities. We've expanded that. And can hear, right? We could hear from people some of the barriers. You know, we had a young man who just wrote me a letter a couple weeks ago who was thanking me for the ability to get him a reader. He's legally blind. He's worked in this office for years. And rather than give him the resources that he needed to be able to move throughout the office, they told him he could only do one assignment. And it turns out that if you give him a reader, he can do anything. And he was tearful penning this letter because we saw him. And the reason we saw him is because he felt safe enough to say that my needs aren't being met, even though I'm not part of the majority of this office. And we heard him and we were intentional about making sure that he and his community were seen.
Time for one more question.
Okay, it's one. All right. So I'll just get straight to it. I am just so blown away by you, by what you've said, and I would like to work for you. So how do I continue to develop the skills? Particularly, we have like clinics coming up where we're able to gain you know, clinical experience. And I'm just looking for, where should I go? Like what skills are you looking for in your interns, in your clerks, and what do you need? Because I'm happy to, I'm so inspired. Thank you so much.
First of all, I like your hustle. Put it out there, put it on the table. I like a hustler's mentality. So you got that checked off the box. You know, things that we look for are people, you know, so I'll tell you what I look for. Sean is on the call, who's our director of legal hiring. I say this all the time. When I swear people in, I'm not looking for people who come to do this work because they've watched The Wire, because they have, you know, watched Law and Order, you know, Special Victims Unit or whatever unit. Like I'm not looking for people who are heroes, right? I'm not looking for people who are coming in here and I'm going to go and save communities. We don't need saviors. We need servants. We don't need saviors. We need servants. We need people who work for the people for whom we serve. And that requires a level of humility, right? Lawyers are some of the most arrogant people you will ever meet. We know everything. We know, you can't watch a movie with a lawyer without like them being like, how you do it, cross. Now y'all see don't break that habit so that you can have friends and family that want to hang out with you, because they're not going to want to hang out with you if you keep being as arrogant as you're being. And I know you are, because you're law students and y'all really think you know some stuff. You do. You take one, criminal justice class and you like habeas corpus this and habeas corpus that.
If I could be candid for a moment, oh, I'm sorry. I would like
Go
to
ahead.
respond. I was just going to say that I personally was very jaded by the criminal justice system. A lot of people know me for a lot of things, and listening to you speak gave me such a different perspective, and it gave me some kind of grip on stepping into that area and actually believing that I can help people. So I'm going to allow you to answer the question that I asked you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Actually,
Don't cede the space, sis. Like, let me just say this. Don't cede the space. What I hear so often, and it's the challenge that we have of people who say, I don't want to be a prosecutor because of mass incarceration, because it is broke. It's not broken. It's doing what it was designed to do. I will say all of those things are true, but we are the most powerful actors in this system. We decide who gets charged and what they get charged with. You don't get before a judge on a felony case without a prosecutor signing off on that. And so when we see these things happening, I can say we're not doing that. And so when we see the space, when we say we're just going to respond, we're going to be public defenders, we're going to be civil rights lawyers, which I absolutely encourage people to do. Absolutely, because we need a strong defense system in this country. We absolutely do. But we need people to be in positions of power to exercise the discretion to do the right thing. By the time you come into the criminal justice system and you get tangled up, it is years, it is time, it is things that you can't get back. And I think one of the most powerful things for me as a prosecutor was my ability to say no. My ability to say no. And so don't get caught up in the like what this system has been. And I don't hide from it. I started with my predecessors killed Fred Hampton. I started with that. And when people ask, how can you sit there? It is because I can say thousands of people now have their convictions vacated because of marijuana. Because hundreds of people who lived in the Ida B. Wells housing projects have their lives back. It is because I can do a great amount of good here, even in a system that is terribly flawed. But if you cede the space, if you just allow people who don't have the lived experience, who don't have that level of, again, personal commitment, there are days, this is why they don't like me talking to students too much, because I get super candid, because I feel like y'all deserve the truth. There are days where I want to walk away, that I absolutely like, I'm tired. And I got these 4 girls who are going to school, and I could make a lot more money and have a lot less stress. But I started where I came from. And it is, for me, I want people who are so in love that this system that has been rooted on white supremacy and patriarchy and a hate and a disdain for certain communities, I want it infiltrated by people who love the hell out of the people we serve. Love them. I want people who love the people we serve with all that they have, because those are the people who are going to make the changes. And so I need humility, I need service, I need good judgment, I need hard workers, and I need people who do this truly, because they recognize how flawed the system is and believe that they can be an agent of change. Those are the basics. Those are the basics. Don't tell me how many, like, the clinics are cool. Like, do a clinic. There's no greater, when we bring you in here, we putting you in the courtroom. I mean, you are learned, it really is trial by baptism. You are thrown into the work and you will grow. We produce some of the best, brightest, most brilliant lawyers in the country because we put you into the work and we train you. And so all of the legal stuff that you are getting is great, right? That's helpful. You need to be a lawyer to come work here. Like, that's the basics. But I'm not looking for people who got all A's. I don't, if you got a 4.0, hats off to you. I didn't. That's the least of my requirements. Are you a servant? Are you humble? Are you willing to learn? And do you have good judgment? That's what I'm looking for.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Big round of applause. Again, we really appreciate your time. It's been a remarkable conversation, learning more about you, even though your press releases have so much information. You're so personable, but hearing it directly from you, hopefully everyone in here will walk away feeling more inspired tonight than they were yesterday. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you again.
Thank you. And we passed on our information. Sean
Yes.
didn't get to speak. She's on here, another Black woman out here doing the recruitment. We passed on how you can get us your
Yes.
resumes. And we do on-campus interviews. We go all across the country. And so certainly we'd be glad to set something up. But we welcome you. I know Sarah George will say come work for her, and she's a brilliant and amazing. But if you want to leave Vermont and come to the Midwest.
Oh, I'm headed back. I'm headed back. Thank you. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Well, I think.